Hello again, everyone. It's so nice of you to come and visit me on this very dreary, very cold day. Don't worry, I've got the fire built up and a lot of great stories for you today. So, welcome to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Get settled in and we'll have some great times and some great stories. I've picked out 5 of my best and I hope that you enjoy them. This first one is quite a tale, and I honestly can't imagine where it came from. It just sort of popped into my mind one day. It's not really scary, more, I don't know what to call it, but it's an interesting story, and I feel it's one of my best. So let's hear a little story about the last mayor of Eden. It all began with the closing of the Walmart. The Walmart was not the catalyst for the death of Eden, but it was the final death throes of a dying town. Eden had never been what you would call a bustling city, with a population that topped out at about 75,000 in the mid-'80s. The city had undoubtedly seen its heyday. The coal mine had finally panned out in '95. The calculator factory had likewise played out in 2002. The paper mill had lasted a while longer, shutting its doors in 2016. That had been the end of the major industry in Eden. The town had continued, of course. The downtown had done a fair bit of business with the summer people who came through. People from out of town always wanted to pick up a summer house or move to the outskirts to get away from it all. Despite the small spikes, the industry was going, and a lot of the people left when the paper mill closed down. Those who remained were the sort of people who couldn't have been blown out with dynamite. They were oldsters who had been there since they came back from World War II or Vietnam, dyed-in-the-wool capitalists who continued trying to bring industry to the area, and real estate people hoping to get one more dollar out of the dying town. Even some of those latter had to take a firm look at what they were trying to sell, when the one seemingly solid job market finally closed up shop. The people of Eden didn't seem to mind, though. Quite the contrary. They were glad the last corporate giant was gone from the area. They talked longingly about getting back to the good old days, and how this would help the waning business on Main Street to thrive again, without big corporations keeping their boot on the throat of the little man. Greg did not agree. For one, he'd been working at the Walmart since he got back from college in 2009. It had been keeping food on the table and the lights on in the dingy apartment that he'd been renting over Abigail's drugs for the better part of a decade, and that's how he liked it. They got the majority of his paychecks, too, and they might as well have been a company store the way Greg looked at it. Even so, it was convenient to have everything within easy reach. The second thing was harder to quantify, but was something that the philosophy teachers at the hoity-toity college he'd dropped out of would have understood all too well. Corporate giant or not, Walmart did not pull out of a thriving town that they could still make money in, as a rule. Watching the semi-trucks with the Walmart logos on them drive for the outskirts of town was like watching the axe-wielding vehicles drive out of the remains of the forest at the end of the Lorax book his mother had read to him as a kid. They had sucked the land dry like a vampire, and now it was time to get out while the getting was good. "Decided where you're going to go work now?" Patty asked, coming up on Greg's side and startling him. I don't know," Greg said morosely. "Abby's been trying to get me to work at the drugstore since Rachel went to college, but she just doesn't pay enough for me to live and eat." "Well, since she's your landlady, maybe she'll give you a little discount if you work for her." Greg laughed at that. The thought of Abigail Worthy giving her own grandmother so much as a nickel off her rent was a laughable prospect. That old biddy would probably haggle with the undertaker when it came time to put her in the ground, and then lodge a complaint for me on the grave when he put too little dirt on top of her coffin. He and Patty chatted for a little bit, making small talk as they watched the town disperse in the now empty parking lot of the supercenter. As the crowd thinned out, Greg stuck his hands in his pockets and told Patty he'd see her around. He walked away from the Walmart, his car having long ago been sold due to lack of use. When you never left town, what good was a car? He'd come back from college a month before his dad died, and had still been there a year after when his mom had told him that she was going to live in Florida with his aunt. He'd moved into the studio apartment over Abigail's, and sold his car the same year. The little hatchback had been great when he'd been putzing around Burbank, but now that everything was in walking distance, it seemed as useless as tits on a boar. He'd gotten about $5,000 for it, and coasted a little until he got the job at Walmart. He'd been working there for the past 10 years, it seemed, stocking shelves and answering questions for customers. You would think that after a decade, management would have cut him a check for his retirement, but Greg had never really paid in. He always said he was gonna every year when the papers came around, but he just never got around to it. It always seemed that when you lived in Eden, you did things tomorrow instead of today. It seemed that when you lived in Eden, you always thought there would be more time.
Stand up straight, Gregory. I'm not paying you to slouch.
Greg sat up and stopped leaning on the glass cabinet that was full of blood testers and diabetes equipment. He'd been working at the drugstore for about 2 months, and he hated every minute of it. To his surprise, Abigail had indeed offered him a discount on rent, but only if he would work for the 14 hours a day that the shop was open. So, from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., closed on Sundays, Greg stood behind the counter and helped old ladies pick out constipation medication or helped old gents find exactly the right size of Depends for their bony asses. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid his rent and kept a bit of food on the table. Aside from selling drugstore things, the widow Abigail also sold a little bit of gas station food that was just affordable enough for Greg to avoid malnutrition. He had asked her once about an employee discount, and it was the hardest he had ever seen the old biddy laugh in her life. When the bell rang over the door, Greg looked up and smiled when he saw Patty coming in. Patty had been coming by the drugstore more and more often now that she knew Greg worked there, and she was a nice distraction from the monotony of his job. She had gotten a job down at the Quick Lube on Main Street, and it seemed that her hands were always caked in grease no matter how many times she washed them, her nail beds oily with the sweat of her labor. Abby glowered at the young woman as she came in, but she wasn't about to turn away a customer, even if most of her fare was to come and flirt with their only employee. Greg was not unaware of Patty's flirtation, but she really wasn't his type. Not that Greg had any right to be picky. He liked her all right, she was a good friend, but the thought of laying in bed with her in the way he had lain with some of the girls that he'd gone to college with made his skin crawl. His mother had always said, "Don't take anyone to bed in Eden, 'cause you're likely related to them," and he supposed it was something that had always resonated with him. "Did you get any of that lava soap I ordered?" Patty asked, and Greg reached under the counter and pulled out a brown bag with 3 bars of the funky orange soap inside. "I gave you the buy 2, get 1 free discount," Greg stage whispered, as he cast a suspicious eye over to the widow. "So generous," Patty said, pretending to blush. "Let me make it up to you after work and take you out for a slice of pizza." "Can't," Greg said somberly. "I'm doing inventory tonight. I'll probably be here till after midnight." Patty looked disappointed, but rebounded quickly. "Some other time, then?" "For sure," Greg said, and Patty paid for her soap and left with a little wave over her shoulder. "I don't know why you keep stringing that girl along, Gregory," Abby said as the door closed behind her. "She's the best thing you're likely to find in a dying town like Eden anyway," setting the barb like she always did. "My mom always said never take anyone to bed from Eden," Gregory said as the widow swept her way around the aisles, "because there was a pretty good chance you were related." "I'm not sure anyone in town would reproduce if they took your mother's maxim to heart," the widow said solemnly, going into the back to do some other sort of busy work. Greg let slip some of the words that his mother or the widow would have swatted him for if they'd been within earshot. He'd been going to Gino's to get his usual BLT and tomato soup, and the chicken noodle soup that the widow loved so much, for the last 2 months, and it had become a part of his daily routine. Miss Abigail had become fond of the soup since taking to her bed, and she didn't seem to complain as much when she had a bowl of it to hand. She'd been sick for about 2 months, and the doctor seemed to think that she might be for the rest of her life. It wasn't cancer or any of those trendy diseases that usually killed people. Nothing so grand as all that. The widow was suffering from regular old pneumonia, and it seemed like it was there to stay. He had come down to Gino's to get their lunch, only to find a close sign on the door, and the windows dark and uninviting. "They left town last night," said a familiar voice, and Greg jumped as Patty startled him again. "He was just open yesterday," Greg complained. "The least he could have done was told somebody." Patty laughed at that. "Greg, I think you were the only one in town that didn't know that Gino's was closing. He was serving you, me, and your boss, and that was it. Everyone else is either too broke to eat there or already gone." Greg looked around and seemed to notice that Main Street was looking a little emptier than it usually did. There were more empty businesses than open ones these days, something that had started happening about the time the Walmart closed a year and a half ago. People had expected it to breathe new life into the town, but really it just stopped a lot of summer people from coming at all, and led to a lot of the businessmen that had been planning things in Eden to pull up stakes and leave town too. Greg could see people milling about as they went between shops, but they were like heat illusions as they moved listlessly between the few open places and the restaurants. "How many people do you think are left in town?" he asked Patty on a whim. "I'd say less than 5,000. Daryl's talking about closing up the grease pit and moving it to Perkins with his mother." Greg was shocked. He's operated that garage ever since he came back from the Gulf War. Yeah, and most of the guys who came to him to get their cars worked on or their oils changed were in the Gulf War with him, too. Most of them are dead, left town, or the government took their driver's license, and they can't drive anymore. "What will you do?" Greg asked suddenly, a little bit nervously. He was aware that Patty still had romantic intentions for him, and even though he didn't want to date her, he certainly didn't want to lose what was likely his only friend. "You think Abigail would hire me? I hear she's got a real slouch working for her right now." "Ha ha," Greg said sarcastically. "She might, but certainly not for anything you could pay your rent with. She hasn't been doing too well lately. I think..." He looked uneasily back at Gino's before finding the words to properly express what he was thinking. "I think she might be dying, Patty." "You could be so lucky. They say she came over in the wagons when they first settled this place. The widow Abby is tougher than a boiled owl, and she'll probably outlive all of us." As Greg looked at the empty diner, he certainly hoped so. But in Eden, it often felt like you could shit in one hand and hope in the other, and see which one filled up quicker. "Gregory," the widow said as Greg blundered by on his way to the drugstore, "come in for a minute. We need to talk." Greg sighed as he turned to walk into her bedroom. This sounded like a "hey, I'm firing you" speech waiting to happen. Greg didn't understand how she could. He was her only employee. He basically operated the store by himself. If she fired him, there was no way she could get out of bed and man the shop by herself. She'd been living with the pneumonia for the last 5 months, and every day that dawned with Gregory hearing her watery cough was another day he knew he wouldn't have to call the coroner to come get her. As he pushed the door to her room open, he grabbed one of the masks from beside the door. He wasn't worried about catching anything from her, but what he might pass on to the frail old woman. The whole room smelled of sick, the sweaty aroma of a body too tired to take regular baths, the smell of old food that hadn't been removed, the stench from her bedpan that he would have to take with him when he left, and the wet smell of phlegm that she constantly hacked into a napkin. She breathed heavily, like someone whose lungs are full of lake water, and she smiled sardonically when she saw Greg. "You aren't quite as handsome as the young man I always pictured coming to take care of me after I outlived my husband, but I'm still glad to have you, Gregory." He smiled as he took her hand, holding it gently. "If you're well enough to be sarcastic, then I could really use your help downstairs," he said, enjoying their daily fencing matches. "I'm afraid there won't be anything to open for much longer, son. I just don't have the strength to go down those stairs anymore, and I fear it won't be long before I go to meet my first husband again." She coughed wetly into a napkin as she spoke, and Greg had the good manners not to snatch away his hand. "It sounds an awful lot like you're firing me," Greg said gently. "I suppose I am," she said,
but gently, I hope.
If you're firing me, it might be hard for me to pay you rent, and then I'm not sure how you'd pay the taxes on this place."
"That could be difficult," she amended, "but so is coming after a corpse for debt."
"How about this?" Greg said. "I'll run the drugstore and manage the accounts so you can keep paying for your medicine if you let me live here and take care of you. Then, when you're gone, you can fire me. How about that?" She laughed, the sound coming out fractured like ice on the cusp of breaking.
"You? How could you possibly run the shop and balance the books and order enough product to keep up with the clientele?"
"Well, I've been doing a pretty good job for the last 9 months, so I figure I'll just keep doing it until—" He stopped himself from saying it, realizing he'd become fond of the old woman in the time he'd been taking care of her. "Until you get better." She chuckled wetly, sounding like a frog, and looked up at him with her big wet eyes.
"You're a good man, Gregory Boyle, no matter what your mother always said about you."
"Keep talking like that," he said, rising up as the sun began to cresp the little window, "and I'll make you come downstairs and do some work."
"Thanks, come again."
The old man smiled toothlessly at Patty as she showed him out. She'd agreed to work at the drugstore after her parents had left their house to her. It's only until they sell it, but they said it was nice to have someone looking after it. Greg had agreed that it sounded pretty cool, but he doubted her parents would ever manage to sell the place. The last realtor had left town 6 months ago, and no one new had bought so much as a cup of dirt from Eden since then. There had been some excitement when a company had purchased the old paper mill, but they had all come in with their trucks and stripped what they could from the factory before leaving. As far as Gregory knew, they had never been back. "You're pretty good at being a checkout girl," Gregory said, grinning as Patty snorted at him. "It's not like it's hard. Most of this stuff sells itself." There was a loud cough from the stairs, and Gregory turned to see Abby making her way slowly down them. She'd been feeling stronger lately, and Gregory had often found her stuck halfway down the stairs. He came to help her, chiding her as she sucked in air soupily. "You're gonna kill yourself like that. You're a little stronger, but don't push it."
"Nonsense," she rasped. "This girl needs proper training. With you to teach her, she'll develop all sorts of bad habits."
"I've got it, Miss Abby. Patty's no slouch. She knows how to do customer service." "It was basically all I did in the automotive department of Walmart," Patty added.
The widow scoffed. "That place wouldn't know customer service if it bit 'em."
But she began to cough more as she elaborated, and Greg had to hold her up as it racked her body. "Come on, let's get you to the rocker out front. You can greet the customers as they come in and maybe get a little sun. I don't want them to think I've got the Halloween decorations out early." She started to protest, but the sun really had done wonders. The doctors had expected her to succumb to her illness months ago, but it was coming up on 2 years, and she was still puttering along. He wrapped her in a blanket and sat her in one of the rocking chairs that dotted the front area. She shivered amidst her layers, the slight breeze reminding Gregory that fall was almost here. He had just gotten her settled when an older woman in a thick shawl approached the shop. "Good morning, Miss Laurie. What brings you here today?" The old woman gave him a wave.
"Just came to get the last of my prescriptions to take to Heavenly View. I'm moving at the end of the week, and they want a list for their physician." "I'll get it for you," Abby rasped, but Greg told her to sit as he went back inside to get the envelope. Losing Miss Laurie to the nursing home would be quite a blow to their business, but Greg had been expecting it. After her husband died, Miss Laurie became a shut-in. She only left the house to see her doctor or fill her prescription, and this was the first time they'd seen her in weeks. As Greg came back with the envelope, he caught the tail end of their conversation. "I'm sure they have room for you, Miss Abby. You could relax with the time you have left and not have to struggle so much. There are people there to help you, and I'm sure Gregory could watch your shop for you." "It sounds awfully nice," Abby said softly, "but I just don't think I can leave Gregory on his own. He depends so much on my wisdom."
Miss Laurie took the envelope, wishing Abby and Gregory the best as she made her way home. The streets were a little less empty today. But the people taking in the sights were nothing but bored locals trying to kill some time. The cars leaving town became fewer and fewer, but that was due in part to the number of residents becoming less and less as well. Greg saw less than a dozen people on a daily basis now, and as the oldsters he'd taken for granted went to either Heavenly View or their heavenly home, their business suffered. Greg watched her go, seeing the potential end of her business as the beginning of the end. Greg flopped onto the rocker in front of the drugstore, his breath coming in deep, grateful lungfuls. All around him, chaos reigned, but its conquest was coming to an end. The fire trucks had taken longer than expected to arrive, Eden's own fire department being little more than 2 volunteers these days. They had both been at home when the fire started, and they had arrived only a little before the trucks from Perkins. It could have been a lot worse. Would have been, in fact, if Greg hadn't smelled the smoke and called for help. As it stood, only 6 buildings had been burned out, their gutted husks looking forlorn in the blinking lights of the fire trucks. Another 4 were damaged, but all 10 had been empty, except for the hardware store. Greg could see Gabriel sobbing quietly on the porch of his father's legacy, the rustic old shop now a burnt cinder that would never rise again. Greg wanted to go to him, especially after all the work he'd done to keep the rest of Main Street from burning, but he was too bone-weary to do much else but sit and be glad that he wasn't crying over a burnt husk too. It had all started at the old ice cream parlor. The building had been abandoned for years, closing up shop right around the same time the Walmart had. That had given the rats that now occupied the space plenty of time to chew on the wires and ruin the electrical box. Greg couldn't prove that that's what had started the fire, but when the smoke woke him up, the peeling white exterior was in full blaze. He'd called the fire department and been redirected to the station in Perkins. As he came out onto the porch, Gabriel was already using one of the big wrenches to pry open the fire hydrant. "Help me!" he gasped through gritted teeth, and as Greg took hold of the wrench, the 2 had water shooting out in no time. They had just managed to smother the worst of the fire at the parlor, when the empty store beside it blazed to life. The next hour became a series of tossing water onto smoldering buildings, only to see the one next to it go up in flames. The old buildings were just so dry, and the summer had been a hot one. The wooden storefronts were little more than kindling to the hungry flames, and even some of the brick fronts began to smoke as their windows shattered from the heat. The trucks showed up, after the 2 men had been joined by a pair from the gas station down the road, Greg having played firefighter for half an hour by that point. The firefighters looked miffed that the 2 had opened a hydrant, but they hooked up anyway, and seemed better equipped at dousing the remains of their once beautiful Main Street. As the trucks rolled away, Greg squinted at the first light of dawn as it crested the broken pavement. He staggered inside, reaching to turn the sign around before realizing the futility. There would be no business today, not with all the smoldering buildings on the street. "Abby, I don't think we're opening up shop today. I'm bone weary, and debris is going to make it impossible to get up the street." He expected her to rasp at him. She was always up early, but he heard nothing. He moved closer to the door, knocking on it, but he still received no answer. He knocked again before pushing inside, seeing her buried beneath her blankets like a small bear. She looked so peaceful, her usual ragged breathing sounding much better today. She usually coughed every 4th breath, but he hadn't heard her cough at all since he'd come in. "Come on, don't be mad. It's been a really long night, and I'm dog-tired. There's no way anyone's going to—" As he got close, he noticed that her breathing wasn't clearer like he'd thought. He'd been so tired that he'd overlooked her lack of coughing and wheezing, thinking she might have finally gotten better. It seemed he was right, as was her doctor. He had said that she would keep the pneumonia for the rest of her life. It appeared that now she was cured of it. She neither wheezed nor rasped, coughed or railed. She lay as peaceful as she had when she was a girl. Her breathing wasn't clearer because she was better. Her breathing was clearer because she wasn't breathing. Greg didn't sleep at all that day, and the trucks from Perry had barely passed the county line when he called for an ambulance he knew would arrive much too late. There were only 10 attendees at Abby Worth's funeral. Greg, Patty, and Mayor Daniel were the only 3 from town, the rest being friends from outside Eden. Abby had a simple service. Her plot in Mount Pleasant was arranged the same year her husband had died. She was laid to rest beside him, and when the mayor agreed to follow Greg and Patty back to the apartment, they were flattered to have him join them for dinner. "You know, she left it all to you," the mayor said, making appreciative noises as he ate the meatloaf Patty had made. Greg almost choked as he looked at the man. "How do you know that?" "I'm the only notary and lawyer in town. She came to me after she got sick and told me she was leaving it all to you. She didn't have any other family. Did you know that? Nomad, I guess. You and Patty here are 2 of about 90 residents left in Eden." That took Greg by surprise. How are there so few? Fire last week made the remaining businesses on Main Street rethink staying. They see the unoccupied buildings as a liability. Most of them sold their shops and moved to Perry or DeCroix. The outliers will be gone at the end of the year. None of them have signed leases for the next year, and by January this place may be the only business in town. The 3 sat eating in silence for a few minutes, letting it all sink in. It seemed that Eden, too, was gasping out its last. "I figure the Jim brothers at Jim Petrol will sign up for another year, but I doubt I'll be here to see them close up shop next year. My term ends in May, and whether nepotism elects me mayor again or not, I'm leaving for Montana. My mother's properties sat empty for too many years, and I think I might be ready to retire to the mountains." He excused himself after that, thanking Patty for the meatloaf as he left the 2 of them in the little apartment. The 2 ate in silence, their grief palpable as they quietly mourned a woman they had both grown close to. "Did I tell you?" Patty finally said, looking up from her laborious task of herding her green beans into a corner. "Someone finally bought Mom and Dad's old house." "Oh?" Greg asked, his mind trying to punch through the film of grief to realize what this meant. Who's the lucky owner?" "State Road Department," she said, managing a small, painful smile. "They bought most of the houses in that area. They're starting work on a highway project that will cut the time from Washington to California by hours. It's bad news for Perry. It'll cut a lot of the little roads out of the equation and give them a straight shot to the coast." What she didn't say was this would also be a huge detriment to Eden, but that hardly seemed to matter. Where will you go?" Greg asked, his food forgotten at the prospect of being one less in a town of ghosts. "I don't know," she said. She was standing at the sink, and Greg could see her in profile. She looked lovely in mourning, a woman that any man would have been lucky to have the love of. She was dependable. She was hard-working. She was kind, and, worst of all, she seemed to put her own happiness aside for Greg. He knew she would give him that love, that she would stay with him in this tiny apartment if he asked her to, but he also knew that it would be selfish to ask. In the movies, Greg would ask her to stay, and they would embrace and kiss, and soon their children would be running through the streets as they watched happily from rockers on the front porch. She seemed to be waiting for just that, but Greg couldn't give it to her. She deserved more than Greg's empty companionship. Patty deserved something more than Greg's fumbling platonic feelings. She told him good night a few minutes later, taking her Pyrex dish and leaving through the familiar stairs. Even in his grief, now elevated by the loss of his friend, Greg wasn't blind to the sobs she tried to muffle. Greg came awake like a hibernating bear, the loud banging on the door enough to wake the dead. Someone was really walloping it, too, slamming their fist against it hard enough to rattle the glass, and Greg came tentatively out of bed. He was wearing only a shirt and jockey shorts, his mid-30s belly hanging over the waistband as he crept from the bedroom and into the living room. He reached for the fire poker as he came, afraid that the empty town might have attracted teenagers bent on helling. They would have seen the lights in the bathroom upstairs and decided to shake the cages a little, and Greg wished he'd thought to grab his shotgun before leaving the bedroom. He came down the stairs in a slow, jerky walk, the pounding not stopping in the least bit. Whoever it was calling his name, too, which was a little off-putting. Greg couldn't imagine anyone he knew in this town being out so late, and banging on his door, but he quickened his pace a little, fearing someone was in trouble. Maybe Patty was hurt. Maybe there'd been another fire. Maybe it was something even worse. He'd been right about that, it seemed, and as the door came open, he found Patty leaning against the frame, grinning at him drunkenly. "There you are, Gregory," she trumpeted, stumbling into him as she slurred an apology. "Are you all right?" Greg asked, trying not to draw attention to her current state, but finding it very difficult. "Right with Eversharp," she said, her hands wrapping around him as she tried to pull him into her arms. "What's gotten into you, Patty?" Greg asked, though it was pretty clear what had gotten into her. As if in response, Patty pressed her lips against his, silencing his upcoming protests. Her tongue was warm and wet as it tried to invade his mouth, and Greg struggled as he tried to push her away. His skin was covered in goosebumps, and he was shuddering as she leaned closer to him. He could taste the alcohol on her breath, and it was making him gag. He didn't know what she'd been drinking, but it was stronger than anything he was familiar with. When she finally pulled away from him, her eyes were streaming tears, and they looked hurt and confused. "Why won't you kiss me back?" she wailed, as she stumbled backwards and bumped into the doorframe. Greg searched for the words, but he just couldn't find them. I just don't think of you that way," he finally blurted out. She sobbed, her eyes gushing as she looked at him blearily. She was drunk and confused, and clearly this had made more sense before she'd come to his home in the middle of the night. Now her hopes were falling to pieces, and she was left with nothing but the understanding that she was alone. He'd been honest with her, but that had hardly cut the sting. "Why won't you love me?" she bawled, her eyes accusatory, even as they gushed tears. "I stayed in this corpse of a town for you, Greg. I worked at a place that barely paid for my groceries and lied to my parents when they wanted nothing but to send me back to college. And for what? I love you, Greg. I've loved you since we were kids. Why won't you love me back?" When he gripped her shoulder, it sobered her a little, and he saw the embarrassment starting to creep into her eyes. "I do love you, Patty. I love you too much to let you settle for someone who doesn't love you the same way you love them. You deserve someone who will love you as deeply as you love me, and I can't do that. Go. Let your parents send you to college. Live the life you deserve. Find someone who will care for you the way you care for me." It was morning before she sobered up enough to leave, and the two had a long talk. Patty cried a lot, Greg finding his eyes too dry for tears. She didn't sway as she left, the alcohol having been burned away by her despair. Greg watched her go, and went to bed as the sun filled the apartment with light. Tomorrow would be Sunday, the only day Abby let them close the store. He'd take tomorrow to mourn, and then open the store on Monday. It seemed appropriate somehow to take a day for himself before getting back to the only thing he was good at. Greg sat on the front porch of Abby's drugs, the snow coming down as it coated the cracked and pitted streets of Eden. It had been 20 years since the widow Abby Worth had passed, and he was still living in Eden, if you could call it living. His hair was now the silver of falling snow, his eyes not as good as they had been, and his legs shook a little when he walked. That didn't stop him from tending the garden that he'd begun growing on 5th Street, or the other on 6th Street, that had borne corn every year since Patty had left. He had a letter from her somewhere upstairs, in the drawer where he kept his prized possessions. She had sent a few others, a wedding invitation, a birth announcement, and a few Christmas cards, but he hadn't received anything from her in 4 years. She would be old too now, and Greg wondered if she might have died. He coughed as he watched the snow, bending double into the rocker as he spat phlegm into it. It sounded as bad as the widow's had, and he didn't need a doctor to tell him that he was dying. It had started as a cough, just a dry thing that was better some days than others, but it had grown wet and rough, and now his breathing was soupy and worrisome. He supposed it would probably kill him, and he found that the idea didn't bother him all that much. He could feel the cold weight of the gold key he wore around his neck, and he smiled as he thought of the day Mayor Daniel had come to say goodbye. He had lasted longer in the town than he'd thought, outlasting the Jim brothers by a whole month. Their contract with Exxon had been canceled when they couldn't pay their gas bill, and without the gas, they had packed up shop and headed to parts unknown. By then, there had been about 60 people on the outskirts, and no one in the town proper. Days would go by between people sightings, but there were still a few who came to the drugstore. It wasn't until the outlying farms and lands began being annexed by the surrounding towns that Mayor Daniels had decided to leave. Greg had looked up when the bell rang and nodded when he saw Daniels walk in. "Something ailing you, Mayor?" he asked, but the graying man had shaken his head. "Not the mayor anymore. I'm heading out, I think. I'm not sure where, but I think Eden is all but played out." He tossed the key to Greg then, the one that would open most any door or any building or storefront that was still good. The mayor's office, the sheriff's office, anything else the town deemed the mayor worthy of guarding. "Guess now you're the mayor, the last mayor of Eden. Wear the title with pride. If you leave, be sure to pass the key to whoever's still here." Greg had never gotten a letter from him, but the key had come in handy when it came to planting and keeping the power on. It also got him a small stipend from the state, which he used to keep the lights on Main Street burning, and some food in his fridge to keep him from starving. Greg hadn't seen anyone wander through Eden in years, save for a few cars that got lost on their way somewhere else. Sometimes ghost hunters or the curious came to visit, and Greg told them what town history he remembered as he tried to ignore their petty theft. They never took much. Anything worth anything was locked away behind one of those doors that his key opened. He supposed they would have it after he was gone, if they didn't mind a little grave robbing or corpse rifling. He coughed then, and when he took his hand away, his palms had red on them. As he looked down Main Street, he could see the collapsed remains of the old Walmart as it hunkered like a tired dog. He remembered standing outside it as he watched the trucks roll away, and it seemed like 1,000,000 years had passed since then. People called Eden a ghost town, and they weren't wrong. As Greg looked up and down the street, he imagined all the ghosts who must reside here. He watched a gaggle of old ladies wandering up the road towards the Baptist church that had burned to the ground 3 years ago during a lightning storm. He saw some school kids laughing up the road as they headed for the ice cream parlor that had started the fire all those years ago. He saw 4th of July parades, Christmas tree lightings in the square, summer days that ended with the sound of cicadas, scarecrow contests that the mayor had resided over dutifully. Greg thought he saw Patty and Abby waiting for him, and as the rise and fall of his chest slowed, he wondered if he might love her in the hereafter, as he never could in life. As he watched the snow come down around him, and the swish of his chair became slower and slower, he supposed he would find out. Some people would claim there's no real monster involved in that story, but I disagree. I think the monster is time, and maybe what it takes from us and what it gives back in the end. Speaking of monsters, though, this one's a little more straightforward. It's about that feeling we get when someone's watching us. The feeling we get when maybe we feel trapped or stuck. So, let's hope on your next outing you don't get trapped in the booth. I hadn't wanted to go to Applebee's, but my friends insisted. I'm not opposed to going out for a meal, but I hate going to Applebee's in our town. It's a gathering place for every half-drunk Chad and happy-hour drunk who doesn't have enough money to drink at the yacht club, but has too much class to go to the Tilted Stool. We aren't big drinkers. I mean, we like to tie on a few sometimes, but these guys get downright sloppy. We get a booth as far from the bar as we can, and it's still so damn noisy in there. By the end of the night, we're all yelling at each other just to be heard over the jukebox or the drunks. I spend the rest of the night with my eardrums pounding and my head ready to crack open. At least that's how it's always been until tonight. So, we're in the back booth, like always, when I see the guy. Mark was talking about some girl he was seeing from work, Frank laughing like a donkey. His latest drink bounced around, threatening to spill as he pounded the table, and I looked up from my cowboy burger, just in time to see this guy hunkered over his food at the end of the row. He was bent over his plate, top of his bald head gleaming, and the light overhead lit him like a wax sculpture. I'm not usually one for people watching, but this guy kind of stood out. He reminded me of a story from Temple, back when I still went with my parents. They told us a story about a guy who'd built a creature to get revenge, a golem, and that was my first thought when I saw this guy. That sounds a little harsh, but I only mean he appeared not like a man, more like the approximation of a man. He had a white button-up, a red tie hanging loose around his neck, and even from here I could see the sweat starting to pool under his arms. Despite the noise, I could hear him almost perfectly, too. At first, I thought he was eating his meal real loudly, bent over at the waist like a dog. But the longer I watched, the more I thought he might be crying. His shoulders were hitching in slow up and down jerks, and he appeared to be sobbing into his plate. I felt a little voyeuristic as I watched him. Poor guy was probably living what was the worst day of his life. He'd probably been stood up for a date or lost his mom, and here I was just watching. When Mark nearly leaned into my ear, I jumped a little when he spoke. "What you looking at, Pally?" He followed my line of sight and found the poor guy before I could. Whew! That's a guy who's got a date with a rope later. Frank turned to look, but winced as Mark kicked him. "Don't look! Ain't you got no sense?" Poor fella. Kinda looks like this guy that came into the gas station the other night. He comes in high as a kite, and when I wouldn't sell him beer, he just starts crying, and Mark went on, but I wasn't really paying any attention anymore. I felt a little bad for continuing to watch him, but I just couldn't turn away. Something about him was mesmerizing. It was like driving past a car crash and being unable to stop staring at the bodies on the pavement. You know it's wrong to stare, but you just can't stop. Frank was braying laughter again, and I could see our waitress contemplating whether to cut him off or not as she came to get our plates. Mark told her he was fine, and Frank ordered another beer. And after several tense seconds and an elbow from Mark, I snapped back to myself and said I was okay too. "Geez, buddy," Mark said as the waitress shuffled off. "You gonna go over and propose?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, biting into my burger and realizing it was about lukewarm. Had I really been staring at that poor guy as my burger turned to ice? "You've been staring at him for like 10 minutes. Thought you were going to order him a drink for a minute." We all laughed, mine being a little forced, and then Mark stood up and waved to a pair coming through the door. Jim and his wife Celine waved at us in turn, and Frank moved to our side of the table so the two lovebirds could sit together. They had been inseparable since college, and I don't think I'd ever seen one without the other more than a handful of times. They excused their lateness, their sitter had been late, and Jim started in on a story about how she had gotten lost and turned down the wrong road, when I turned my attention back to the poor guy 2 booths down. He was still bent over his burger, still quietly sobbing, but the way his shoulders moved had started to seem wrong. I was no expert on sobbing, but this guy's herky-jerky movements were starting to look like something else. A rational part of me chastised myself for continuing to stare at this poor guy, but I was like a moth to flame now. He was my car wreck, and I was starting to notice signs of foul play. When he snorted loudly, I heard the laughter for the first time. It made me shiver a little as I heard it thrum into me like a badly played piano note. The guy wasn't crying. He was laughing. The more I looked, the more I could see bits of meat and lettuce sprayed over the tabletop. The longer I looked, the more I wondered how I'd misunderstood his laughter for crying. I was now drawn deeper into this web of strangeness. No escape in sight. Crying was one thing. I could understand crying, but who sits in a booth by themselves and laughs? Was he nuts? Some kind of mental case who was off his meds? Watching him from behind Selena's shoulder, I wondered if he might be dangerous. Maybe we should leave. Maybe I should suggest that we change venues, but all thought of escaping fled from me as he lifted his head from that plate. The scream that welled up inside me was cut off by my constricted throat and likely sounded like nothing so much as a sigh. The man's face looked like a fantastic bit of prosthesis. He was like a piece of Halloween decoration that's just a little too realistic. The kind you worry might contain a person who wants to bite. His face looked like the front of a thumb, calloused and rippled with wrinkles or ridges. His eyes were like colorless slits, something slashed into his face with a knife. His nose appeared to be drawn on, like a cartoon character's. He was unreal, something that shouldn't exist in polite society outside of a circus tent. His mouth, though, his mouth was the worst. His mouth was full of long, needle-like teeth, reminding me of an anglerfish as it protruded from his thin lips. Those teeth looked like they would never close comfortably. From here, it looked like they would constantly poke at your lips and gums, and you would be in agony most of the time. There were pieces of meat on those teeth, red raw chunks that had been speared by them, and that's when I looked down at the plate. It was covered in the grisly remains of what looked like chunks of raw hamburger meat. I doubted like hell that the staff had just handed this guy raw beef, but the alternative seemed even wilder. The alternative was that this man had brought his own raw meat from home so he could just consume it here in public. As the horror ran through me like ice water, I looked up to see those colorless slits observing me. The two of us just stared at each other for a count of 5. Then he pulled those thin lips and monstrous teeth into a smile, and I could see red pooling at the edges of his flesh. I glanced over at Mark and Frank, both now sitting on my side of the booth, but neither of them had noticed him. The 4 of them were involved in a conversation like there wasn't a monster sitting 12 feet from us. It seemed impossible that anyone could be having a normal conversation so close to that creature. Its very presence should have triggered some ancient primal node deep in our brains and forced us to either destroy it or flee from it. The 4 of them were talking about jobs and school and Jim and Celine's daughter, while this thing got to exist in humanity with the rest of us. It was too much to handle. Suddenly I wanted out. I wanted to be anywhere but there. I tried to tap on Mark to get him to move or to look up or just acknowledge that I was losing my mind within easy reach of him. But my body wouldn't respond. I managed to flick my fingers at his arm, bumping him a little, but he only rubbed a hand over it as if a bug had landed on him. Celine was talking about the new Pokemon game, and Mark and Frank were just nerdy enough and broke enough to be enraptured by her descriptions. I was stuck in a state of eye contact with that thing, and the longer I looked, the more it seemed to drink me in with those strange eyes. Then, without warning, it began to sink down in its seat, becoming lost beneath its table. I panicked. Suddenly not being able to see it was worse than having it on display. Could it sink beneath our table? How far could it go? How close could it get? I was suddenly imagining the damage those teeth could do to a foot, even a foot within a shoe, and I pulled mine up a little higher as Selena's words washed over me. He didn't resurface for quite some time, and you would have said that such a thing would not have gone unnoticed. Then he slid back up from under the table on the opposite side of the booth. He was grinning from ghastly ear to ear, and he looked like a little kid who's trying to play with the table behind them. There was still a table between us and him, but I was no longer sure how much protection that provided us. I didn't know his mental state, and whether he meant to do us harm or not, but when he dipped back down again, I started shaking. "What's wrong with you?" Mark asked suddenly, turning to look at me as I shuddered beside him. I pointed to the empty plate where the man had been sitting, and Mark looked over before scoffing loudly. "Oh no, your boyfriend left. Don't worry, I'm sure most of those guys at the bar will take you home if you ask them nicely enough." "What's going on?" Jim asked, noticing my discomfort and looking alarmed. "He's obsessed with the guy that's sitting a couple of tables back. Couldn't take his eyes off of him, I swear. Thought he was gonna try to console the guy for a minute. Dude was just sitting there crying, and this freak's over here looking at..." The bald, sweaty head began to surface behind Selena, and when I shouted for her to look out, the whole restaurant went dead silent. Jim and Selena turned to look, but there was nothing behind them. I'd had enough, though. I pushed Mark and Frank out of the way, freeing myself from the booth as I went to go check under the table behind us. He'd be crouching down there, grinning like the little goblin that he was. But as I got down on my knees and looked beneath, I was greeted by nothing but an empty space. The waitress asked me what I was looking for as I moved to look under his table as well, but by then I was already intent on leaving. I got in my car, threw the keys in the ignition, and sped off as fast as I could. Sitting at home now, I can't get that image out of my head. My phone's been blowing up, and I know my friends are worried. I can't make sense of it. What was that thing? Why did it take such an interest in me? Is it dangerous? Did it follow me home? Every time I close my eyes, I see those repulsive needle-like teeth and the no-color slits looking back at me. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything but that creature again. Moving right along, we've got a strange little tale about a man's obsession and the things he builds in the world just below his home. I'm sure some of you have heard of toys in the attic, but today we'll be talking about trains in the basement. Joe loved trains. He loved them since he was little, and it was a love affair that had lasted a lifetime. He had gotten his first train set when he was 5 years old, and though the models he had now were as different from that set as he was from the child he had been, he still remembered it fondly. His train set in the basement of the home he shared with his wife and daughter, and the table he had set up were so big that it took up nearly half the floor space. His wife often bemoaned how much room it ate up, but he ignored her for the most part. He paid the bills, he slaved away at work so his wife and daughter could live comfortably, and when he got home, all he really wanted to do was relax with his trains. He had a little cap he wore and a special pair of overalls, and he sat and listened to the trains chug along, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him anywhere else in life. He would sit down here for hours sometimes, just playing with his trains and letting life pass him by. He could hear his wife, Debbie, moving around upstairs, but he put her out of his mind, too. Debbie would call down to let him know that dinner was ready, and then he'd have to leave his cap on the hook and go upstairs and spend time with his family. His family. Ugh, they were so dull. His wife would ask him about his day, a day that had been boring and monotonous and would be better forgotten in the basement with his trains. Jennifer would talk about cheerleading or some boy she liked, and Joe would pick at his food as he listened to nothing but the clickety-clack of train wheels in his mind. He was dreading hearing her come down the stairs, consoling himself by watching the trains go by. That's when he noticed the house for the first time. The house had been purchased at a hobby store 2 towns over. His wife had complained when he had told her where he was going to get the things he needed for his train set, but it really couldn't be helped. The hobby shop in town was not the sort that stocked train things. The greasy man behind the counter, the one wearing the Led Zeppelin t-shirt and a shiny ponytail, had pushed his glasses up his nose and informed Joe that unless he were here to play Warhammer, they did not stock models for that sort of hobby. So, Joe had gone 2 towns over to find a man who carried his sort of hobby. He had gotten about 5 little wooden houses for his diorama that day, but it was only now that he realized one of them looked a lot like his house. He hadn't painted them, they had come just as they were, but as he watched his trains chug around the place, he could see that one of them was a white house with a tan roof and a picket fence that went all the way around it. Joe didn't remember having seen it before, but as the train came around to pass it, he found his attention suddenly pulled to it. It was like a scene in a movie where the shot zoomed in on a certain object, and Joe felt his eyes drawn there inexorably. The house was sitting next to the tracks, and whoever might take in the breeze in the evening on the front porch would have a great view of the trains as they went by. In fact, he thought he saw someone leaning on the windowsill doing just that. There couldn't be anyone doing that. Joe hadn't put any people in any of the houses, but he saw someone nonetheless. He couldn't make the fellow out. He was like a giant trying to see a passing sparrow. But the longer he stared, the more familiar the man looked. As the train rolled past and kicked its water vapor smoke into the air, he imagined that he could see someone watching it wistfully. Joe put it out of his mind, swapping his CB steamliner for a larger diesel engine, and went back to enjoying the trains. Even so, as they continued to rumble around the track, he was drawn back to that house again and again. The man leaned on the sill and watched the locos as Joe swapped out trains. Was he a man? Joe felt certain that he was. He was still leaning there, watching the trains roll past with fascination, when Debbie called down to tell him that dinner was ready. Joe glanced at the stairs, momentarily drawn out of his daze, but when he looked back at the little man, he was gone. Maybe his wife had called him to dinner too, Joe thought with a snort as he put his hat on the hook and climbed the stairs. He'd have plenty of time after dinner to search for him again as he ran his trains on their endless courses through the landscape that he had created. And Martha said that her daughter got accepted into Ohio State. After all that bragging about getting into Dartmouth, her daughter couldn't get any higher than our own little state college. It just goes to show you what bragging gets you. Joe was plowing absent-mindedly through his mashed potatoes as Debbie prattled on about some friend of hers whose daughter was apparently too dumb to get into her college of choice. Ohio State was a fine college. Joe had gone to Ohio State to get his degree in engineering, but he didn't feel like saying as much. If he just agreed with her and let her get it out of her system, then she'd likely let him get back to his basement so he could play with his trains. He glanced over at his daughter, Jessica, and saw that she was attached to her phone as usual. She didn't have time for much else these days, and between TikTok and Instagram, she barely seemed to be in the world. She had no time for her parents, just her friends and her fans. Joe didn't really care. He was no better if he thought about it, and her attention to the phone meant that he had more time with his trains. And then she said she might make her daughter wait a year so she can take the entrance exam to Dartmouth again. Can you imagine having such a stagger between high school and college? You would... Can I be excused? Jessica asked suddenly. Diana wants to go live in a few minutes. Jessica, you've barely touched your vegetables, Debbie lamented, but Jessica was already getting up and leaving. Me too, said Joe, taking his plate to the sink, his vegetables noticeably gone. Debbie pursed her lips as the two of them made their hasty way to their various hobbies. "Sure, why not? I only cook the dinner, but I suppose I'll do the dishes, too." Neither of them were listening, though. Joe was heading downstairs, Jessica taking the stairs to the second floor 2 at a time, and Debbie was left sitting at the table. She wanted to cry. She wanted to rage at them, but she picked up her phone instead. She had a message there, a message that made her smile, and soon her absentee family was as far from her mind as Martha or her dummykin's daughter. The trains thundered over the plastic track, making their way through the little town that Joe had built for them. He could have as many as 5 trains going simultaneously on this setup, if he wanted to. As long as he kept his eyes on the switching times, they would never run afoul of each other. In the beginning, Joe had been afraid to run more than 2 at once, but now he was comfortable enough to run as many as he wanted. He could run 5 without even thinking about it, and that made him feel proud somehow. It was a silly thing to feel proud of, but he found that he did. And why shouldn't you feel proud? The rail line sure can't run itself, came a voice from the model below. Joe jumped a little, looking around to see who was talking. He looked at the steps, but there was no one there. He stood up, his chair making a harsh noise as he did, but as he looked across the basement, he couldn't find anyone there either. The voice hadn't been very loud, like a voice from outside, and he looked up to the little window near the top to see if someone was peeking in on him. "Down here, hoss," came a voice from the model, and he looked down to see someone sitting on the porch of the house that had looked a lot like his. He didn't remember putting a rocking chair on that porch, but as he watched, it went back and forth, and a tiny little man watched the trains roll by. Joe leaned down, coughing as one of the trains belched smoke as it went by, and as he looked, he saw the weathered face and overalls of an old man. He looked like a farmer, what his dad would have called a corn husker, and he had a little pipe in his mouth that was making its own smoke. Joe leaned down beside the house, and if the man was bothered by the presence of a giant man looming over him, he never showed it. "'Bout time you noticed me. I've been waiting." Joe was speechless for a moment, trying to figure out a sense to the sudden arrival of this miniature man. Who are you?" he finally settled on. "Me? Why, I'm Bill Williams, remember?" Joe furrowed his brow. He didn't, but the name did sound familiar. The old man laughed. "Don't tell me you forgot your own town of Macklin. You built it, after all." Joe nodded. He had thought of the little town here as Macklin, named after the little town that he had grown up in, but he didn't think he had ever actually written anything down to christen it so. Come to think of it, the house here was where he had decided that Bill Williams would live. It was something he had been thinking about, as he planned to put down mailboxes outside the homes, and this was the house that he had planned to set the Williamsons' box outside of. Joe nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I had been planning to flesh the town out some. And not a moment too soon. We were feeling a little two-dimensional down here. Fred was just saying the other day." "Fred?" Joe asked. Bill cocked a finger at the house next door. "Yes, sir, Fred Murphy. He's only lived here since his folks passed a couple years ago, but we're real fond of him. He got his leg blown off in Korea, but he's got one of them new prosthetic legs, and he gets around just fine." As he said it, a little guy came out of the house next door and wished his wife a fond farewell. He had a pretty noticeable limp, but Bill was right. It didn't slow him down in the least bit as he went down the steps and climbed into a little blue Datsun Matchbox car that Joe had glued into place there. To Joe's further surprise, he started the car up and drove off down the road. It sure was swell of his old man to leave him the hardware store down on 5th Street. Fred does a swell job of running it now, and we all thank him for it. The blue Datsun took its time as it went from the little red house beside Bill's to the hardware store about 3 streets over. Joe had made it from a kit that he'd picked up at Walmart around Christmas time, But as Fred climbed out and stumped towards the festive cardboard building, Joe thought it looked far more three-dimensional than he remembered. He'd been so busy focusing on Fred and his shiny blue car that he jumped a little as the post truck drove by, and a hand came out of the window to put mail in the box. "Right on time. Letter carrier Loretta is always so punctual. We were sure sad to see Charlie retire, but Loretta has been a great mail lady in his absence. Her daughter just got into Ohio State. Did you know that? We're all so proud of her. It's quite a school." Joe was practically kneeling beside the table as it all came to light before his very eyes. His trains weren't the only thing moving suddenly, and he saw people going to the shops and driving their cars over the streets. A little bell rang as a group of kids left the schoolhouse, heading for home. Some people went into the department store he had built on Main Street, while a few others went to the bank. There were homes to go back to, dinners to eat, TVs to watch, and Joe seemed to be master over all of it as he watched it all stretch out before him. Bill knew them all, every story, every home, and he regaled Joe with countless tales of their lives. Joe, for his part, was enthralled. He sat listening to Bill as the sun began to set outside the little window above his head, and when it became too dark to see, he reached up to pull the light cord, almost absent-mindedly. The Christmas lights he had strung above the model twinkled like stars, and Joe saw headlights wink on as people made their way home or out for other activities. When his wife called to tell him that she was going to bed and asked if he meant to stay down there with his trains all night, Joe realized it was nearly 10 o'clock. He had spent all afternoon down here talking to Bill about the little town he had made out of cardboard and model kits, and now he needed to get some shut-eye. Needed to, but didn't really want to. "Land sakes," Bill said, checking his watch. "I gotta get to bed. Sorry, Hoss, but we'll have to continue this some other time. Tomorrow, maybe," he said, and Joe thought he looked almost as hopeful as Joe was. Of course," Joe said hurriedly. I'll come down right after work." "Sounds like a plan to me. See you tomorrow, Joe," Bill said. He went into his house, and Joe reached up to turn the lights off before deciding to leave them on. Let the little people enjoy the stars tonight. Joe couldn't honestly remember a better week in his life. It had been hard to sleep that first night, his mind all a-tizzy with the concept of a whole city in his basement, but he had finally managed to drop off. He had blown through his work the next day, finding joy in tasks that had been nothing but mundane until then, and he had finished early that day. He'd come home while his wife was out buying groceries and went straight to the basement to talk to Bill. The little man knew everyone in town, and Joe was so engrossed in his stories that his wife had come halfway down the stairs before he even heard her. "You're home early?" she said almost hopefully. "Yeah, I got done with my stuff early, so they said I could go," Joe said. They stood staring at each other as the smile slipped off her face. She had clearly been hoping that he had come home early to surprise her, but it was becoming apparent that he had come home early to play with his trains. Joe couldn't understand her sudden interest or the increasing slip back towards this interest. She had expected something, maybe? Had he forgotten something, like a birthday or an anniversary? He was bad at remembering those. Joe often found it hard to relate to people. He sometimes wondered why Debbie had agreed to marry him at all, but he believed that she had once found these things endearing in him. Joe wasn't sure what had changed, but it wasn't him. "Well, I'll just leave you to it. Dinner should be ready in a little while. I'll call you." She went back upstairs, the door closing a little harder than it strictly needed to when she got to the top. Wonder what that's about," Bill asked. Joe had only shrugged, and the rest of the week had gone by much the same. If Debbie seemed more distant than usual, Joe hadn't noticed. If she spent more time on her phone, what of it? Jessica spent most of her time on the phone. Maybe Debbie had found something to do on her phone, too. He spent most of his time in the basement talking to Bill as he learned about the fascinating history of the town and its people. The longer they talked, the more real the town seemed. The buildings took on definition. The cardboard surfaces became three-dimensional. The pictures on the outside seemed to grow, the barrels and bicycles and signs they bore, and the whole town came to life before his eyes. Before Joe knew it, it was Sunday, and he was sitting in the basement with Bill having a beer. "Joe, we're friends, aren't we?" Bill asked suddenly. Joe nodded, not having to give much thought to it. "Yeah, Bill, I'd say we are. And friends tell people things they suspect might change their lives, don't they?" Joe nodded, a little slower, not sure where this was going. "Well, Joe, they say a man's home is his castle, and I believe your wife is trying to invite a dirty rascal into your castle." Joe's eyebrows knit together. "What you mean, Bill?" "I mean, your wife was down here doing laundry a couple of days ago, and she was talking to somebody on the phone. Conversation was getting, shall we say, a little spicy. And I thought to myself, good for Joe. He deserves a little something extra. But when she called the fella by name, the name wasn't Joe. This guy's name was Simon, and it seems your old lady is really taken with him." Joe wasn't sure how to process this. Why would Debbie cheat on him in the first place? He paid the bills, maintained the insurance, kept the cars up, fixed the house when it needed it, and paid a handyman when he couldn't fix it. He did all the things that were expected of him, and if she felt uncared for, why hadn't she said something? "Bill," Joe said, not really sure what to say, "are you sure?" "I think I am, Joe. Think you may need to get your house in order. Now, I say this as your friend, Joe, but it ain't right for a woman to run around on a man like that. She needs to be corrected, Joseph. She needs to be reminded who's in charge around here." Joe shuddered as he took a sip of his beer. No one had called him Joseph in a long time. The only person who called him Joseph was his father, and he was dead and in the ground. The name felt like footsteps on his grave, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Joe perked up his ears as he heard footsteps overhead, the clank of plates as they were set out, drawing him back to reality. Sounds like dinner's ready. I should go, Bill. Debbie will be expecting me." Sure, Bill said. "Man needs his victuals. Come back when you can, Joe. I'm not going anywhere." Joe went slowly up the stairs, watching the model get smaller and smaller as he climbed. He wasn't sure he would be back after dinner. Joe might have lost his taste for trains. Just a little bit. Joe grimaced as he ate the hamburger helper. Joe hated hamburger helper. The noodles were always mushy, the cheese always tasted funny, and there was just something unnatural about the concoction. It really wasn't a fit meal for Sunday dinner anyway. Debbie usually made ham or burgers or something with some substance. He would be hungry again in no time after a meal like this. Jessica was picking at her food, but Debbie's was still untouched. She was glued to her phone, texting someone, and by the look on her face, she was enjoying the conversation. There was a look there that Joe had never seen before, not even when they were dating, but it was a look he knew. It was that sultry look that women sometimes got when they were talking to someone they liked, maybe even liked a lot. "I might go see some friends after dinner," Debbie said, taking up her plate and dumping the cooling lump back into the pan. "You guys may have to fend for yourself for bedtime." Jessica shrugged. "Sounds good. Have fun, Mom." She didn't even bother to look at Joe. Debbie just went upstairs to get ready, leaving him to take care of cleanup. He was still scrubbing when she left, and when he asked when she would be back, Debbie just said not to wait up. Joe couldn't help but notice she was wearing her favorite dress, the black one without sleeves, and that this was usually a date night outfit. It had been a while since they'd had a date night, not since her birthday a few months ago, but Joe recognized the dress. He finished the scrubbing and grabbed another beer, heading for the basement again. He needed to talk to someone, and Jessica certainly wasn't going to be any help in this situation. The following week was so different from the one before it that Joe almost felt like he had whiplash. Debbie went out almost every night, and when she was in, she was glued to her phone. She took her phone calls outside or upstairs in her room these days, and he had noticed some new clothes hanging on the closet door. You would have said this would be great, Joe left to his own devices to pursue his interests, but something had changed after Bill had told him about his suspicions. He didn't suddenly find himself afraid of losing Debbie. This wasn't a Hallmark movie, but he did worry about how this would change his routine. Suddenly the prospects of not having as much disposable income, of having dinner late, or his responsibility, or having to worry about clean clothes and dishes in the sink, was a real problem. Then, of course, there was the little voice whispering in his ear as he sat in the basement, contemplating his situation. "She's making a fool out of you, Joseph, strutting around with someone else, probably already in his bed and violating her wedding vows. She's putting cuckold's horns on you, and that ain't right." Joe drank his nightly beer, the bottles becoming plural as the week went on, and thought about what Bill was saying. It's impossible," Joe said at first. "Why would she do such a thing? I'm a great provider. She'd have no reason to go looking for someone else." Bill had snorted. "Who knows, Joseph? Sometimes women are just unreasonable. They feel like what they have isn't good enough, so they go looking for something on the side. Who can say what's going through her head?" Joe didn't want to believe it, but he was slowly beginning to come around. As he and Bill sat and listened to the trains run and the town thrive, Joe wished he could go live in Macklin himself. Life in Macklin looked simple, and Joe could use something simple right now. His life had become very complicated as of late, and he wanted to return to something more wholesome, a place where wives and daughters honored their father for his sacrifice, and dinner was on the table when he got home, a place where people were satisfied with their lot. By Thursday, Joe was certain that his comfortable life was coming unraveled. He came down in the same clothes he'd gone to work in, not feeling like dressing in his conductor's overalls much these days, and found Bill sitting with Fred on the porch as the two smoked their cigarettes. They had been talking quietly as he came down, but they looked up and waved as he noticed them. "Got some bad news, Joe," Bill said, taking a long drag off his cigarette before letting the smoke out like some kind of a wrinkled dragon. "Your old lady had a friend over to the house today." This was news to Joe, since Debbie hadn't been here when he'd come home. He'd found the breakfast dishes in the sink, the clothes still on the line, and his wife gone off somewhere. Joe told himself that she was getting things for dinner, but who knows? Was she out with friends, or just one friend? He didn't know that either, but he was beginning to suspect it was just the one friend now. "How can you be sure?" Joe asked, not wanting to believe it. "Shoot, Joseph, you could hear 'em carrying on up there. I'd imagine there's a few loose springs in your bed these days. Then they left again, and then you came home about an hour later." Joe sat down heavily, trying to make sense of all of it. This can't be happening. I refuse to believe this is happening," Joe said, putting his face in his hands as he rested his head on the table. "Afraid it is, hoss," Bill said, taking another long drag off his cigarette. "I'm just glad my Millie never strayed like this. Think we both know what would have to happen if she did, don't we?" he said, he and Frank nodding in unison. Joe opened his fingers as he turned his head. What would have to happen? "Well, let's just say there'd be a fresh plot in the backyard if my old lady tried to step out on me like that." Joe was silent for a few seconds, seeming to weigh Bill's words as he thought about what he was saying. I could never do anything like that." Bill gave him a hard look, no mean feat for someone with eyes that small, before shrugging. "Nah, I guess not. I guess we're just cut from different cloth, hoss." Joe went back upstairs, the basement suddenly not seeming so inviting. The house above was quiet. Jessica hadn't come home, spending the night with a friend, and Debbie was still out. Joe went to the kitchen to see if there was anything to eat, but most of it looked less than appetizing. In the end, he just sat there as night fell outside, his stomach grumbling and his anger rising. Who was Debbie out there with? Had she actually brought them to the house? He wondered briefly if what Bill was telling him was real, if the little people of his train town were real, but the thought wouldn't hold. Of course they were real. They spoke to him, and he had seen them with his own eyes. Joe wasn't imaginative enough to create something like that from whole cloth. Joe liked trains, he liked to build, but he wasn't delusional. The idea that this might be some kind of psychotic break never even occurred to him. In his mind, everything was ordered, and Joe had everything in its proper place. The headlights of Debbie's car slid across him as she pulled into the driveway. He heard her come up the walk, heard her keys slide into the lock, and as she came in, he watched her take her shoes off before coming inside. She was creeping in like a kid out past curfew, and when she saw him lurking in the dark living room, she jumped and screamed, dropping her shoes. "Jesus, Joe," she said, putting her hand to her chest. You scared me to death." Joe didn't say anything, just watched her as she bent down to collect her shoes. "Were you expecting dinner? Sorry, I went out with some of the girls. I figured you could manage for yourself for a night." She was smiling. All smiles was his Debbie. But when he didn't say anything or get up to follow her, she sighed and rolled her eyes. "Are you mad or something? It was just one meal. It's not like you pay me any attention when I'm here anyway. Figured you'd be thrilled to have the house to yourself. Just you and your trains." She stood looking at him for a count of 12, but Joe really couldn't think of anything to say. "Fine, be that way," she said dismissively. "I'm going to bed. Good night." As she went up, Joe began to feel a little guilty about thinking she might be stepping out on him. He'd been paranoid. Surely it was nothing. She had a good life here, but it seemed it was getting a little mundane for her. She just wanted to go out more and do some fun things. Joe was a bit of a homebody. Maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world if he had to cook a meal for himself now and then. As the Starrlight came on, though, Joe saw something that made him rethink. He had been on the verge of rising, meaning to apologize for being weird, when he saw a purple mark on her neck. It wasn't huge, wasn't ghastly, but it was big enough to be noticed by Joe from his seat on the couch. She had made no effort to hide it, may not have even been aware it was there, but as she headed upstairs, Joe headed down to the basement instead. He owed Bill an apology, it seemed. The weekend went by without much trouble. Joe spent most of it home by himself since Jessica went to stay with a friend, and Debbie went on a girls' weekend with her friends. Friends, Joe thought, as she kissed his cheek and walked out the door with her suitcase. Right. He believed that, as much as he believed that the hickey she had covered with makeup was a rash. By the time the two of them came back Sunday night, Joe was ready for Monday. He'd practiced a few times, a few of those times ending painfully, and as he slid back in through the basement window, he made no sound. He had eaten his breakfast that morning, kissed his wife goodbye, and left for work, just as he had 100 times before. Then he pulled into the parking lot of the Dunkin' Donuts about 3 blocks away and called his boss to tell him he wasn't feeling well and that he'd be taking the day off. His boss had understood, had told him he hoped he felt better, and Joe had slid his slacks off to reveal jogging pants underneath. His polo came off too, revealing a tight jogging shirt, and he added a hat and some sunglasses before leaving the car and jogging up the road. When he came to his house 30 minutes later, there was already a car in the driveway. It appeared she hadn't wasted any time. As he came slowly around the side of the house, he could see the two of them embracing in the living room. Debbie with her hands all over a dark-haired man, a little younger than Joe. Joe could have probably come right into the front door without them noticing, and they worked their way upstairs as he made his way to the basement window. He couldn't believe she was doing something like this in the living room, with the curtains open nonetheless. Anyone could see her. He was in through the window in a matter of seconds, and no one in the house was the wiser. As he came to the head of the stairs, he reached down beside the banister and felt for what he had hidden there. Joe wasn't a violent man, but he understood the need for home defense. His father had owned this particular shotgun since Joe was a kid. When he died, Joe had taken it to his house. Debbie hadn't liked it, saying that Jessica might hurt herself with it, so Joe had always kept it in the basement. He had thought it was stupid then, but now he was glad that she hadn't let him put it in the bedroom closet like he'd wanted. It would have been harder to lay hands on there. "Good luck," Bill said from the model, and Joe nodded to him as he made his way quietly up the stairs. He could hear them as he came into the kitchen, but the basement door had been oiled, so it wouldn't give him away. They would never know how many times he had practiced this, how many times he had crept from the basement to the bedroom. This would definitely qualify as premeditated if he was caught, and any investigator worth his salt would be able to tell. Joe didn't care, though. Bill had already let him know that this was something a husband did when he loved his wife and needed to let her know her place. That place, Joe knew, would be in the backyard by the oak tree. There were clothes scattered around the living room, but nothing too intimate. A sock here, a pair of stockings here, a shirt thrown across the couch, a shoe by the door, and all in line towards the stairs. They'd been busy already, and Joe wondered what she would have done if he had forgotten something and had to come back. Joe realized that she knew him too well, though. He never forgot anything. Joe was meticulous, driven by his routine, and he would have no more forgotten something he needed than he would have left without his pants. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, listening to them as they did their cheating on the floor above. It was shameful. She'd never made noises like that for him, even when he had been interested in things like that. She had mostly just lain there, dutifully, but it sounded like she was being more than dutiful for him. He stopped again at the midpoint as the stair creaked a little, but they were making too much noise by then. They didn't even hear as he slid the door open, but when he cocked the shotgun and pointed it at the pair of them, Debbie screamed in something other than passion. The gun blammed before either of them could make their case, and Joe was left standing there in the aftermath. Joe came running into the basement, slamming the door behind him and throwing the lock. He could see the flashing lights from the basement window, and he knew that they'd be coming down the stairs any time now. His plan hadn't been quite as well planned as he had thought, and now it was all coming apart. He had stood there in the bedroom, looking over what he had done for several minutes before he heard sirens coming from up the street some. There was no way they had already been called about the gunshot. Less chance that they were close already. Someone had to have seen him go into the house. Someone who had then heard the shots while they were still on the phone with the emergency services. Now they had his number, and he was out of escape routes. Joe went to the model, looking down at Bill's house as he tried to find the old man. For one terrible second, he was worried that he wouldn't be there, that it would have all been a trick or a delusion, and that he had done all this for nothing. No cars moved on the street, no people walked between the buildings, and as the voice came from the floor above, Joe started to shake. "Bill! Bill, I need your help! The cops are after me, Bill!" No answer. Joe heard something heavy hit the front door, rattling the frame. "Bill! Bill!" Bill said nothing. The loud bang came again. "Bill!" Joe yelled, hearing something break upstairs as whatever they were hitting the door with broke the frame. "What's all the ruckus, hoss?" Joe looked down, seeing Bill as he stuck his head out of the window of the second story. His hair was standing in corkscrews, and he was rubbing his eyes sleepily. Bill looked as if Joe had awoken him from some deep sleep, and Joe wondered how anyone could sleep through something like that. Joe's heart was hammering like the cops on his door, and his blood pressure felt ready to send his heart out of his chest. "Bill, thank God! Listen, the cops are at the door. They're going to arrest me." "Oh," Bill said, leaning out the sill. "Well, that is a problem." The two were quiet for a moment, staring at each other, and Joe winced as he heard the door cave in under their blows and boots as they came into the foyer. "What do I do?" Joe asked. Bill said, the police upstairs telling Joe to come out with his hands up. "I suppose you could turn yourself in, let 'em know you caught your wife cheating, and just kind of snapped." Joe heard someone test the lock on the basement door before calling for help. "Aw," Bill said, "you could always come live here." Joe looked surprised. You mean in Macklin?" "Sure. You know, we've been looking for a conductor for the railroad. You could live at the railway house, drive the trains, and never worry about anything ever again." Someone drove a boot into the basement door, and the lock shuddered. "How?" Joe asked. Bill extended a hand. "Come with me, Joe. Come away from all that and live with decent folks." Bill's whole hand wouldn't fit on the end of Joe's finger, but as he reached carefully towards him, the tingle that ran through him was worse than the most painful Charlie horse he had ever had. When he opened his eyes, however, he was face to face with the smiling old man. "Joe," Bill said, casting a hand out to the city, "welcome to Macklin." Jessica opened the basement door and looked down into the darkness. It had been 5 years since her mother's death and her father's disappearance, and Jessica hadn't been back since the day her grandparents had driven away from her childhood home. She was 22 now, about to leave for college, and was hoping to maybe get a little help with tuition after she sold the house. Everything else that her parents had owned had been sold and the money placed in trust for her, but she wasn't allowed to touch it until she was 25. Great. Thanks, Mom and Dad. That was really going to help her pay for college. Selling the house would more than get her what she needed, but Jessica hated coming back here. The house had remained untouched for the last 5 years. The locals thought it was haunted. Most of them also thought her dad was secretly living in it, and he had taken refuge in the walls after killing her mom. But if he had, then no one had ever found him. Everyone believed he had killed her mother, shot her and her lover in the bed that they had shared, and then made a clean escape. Jessica had mixed feelings about the situation, feelings that made grieving difficult when the wound was fresh. On the one hand, her mom had been cheating on her father, and that was bad. On the other, her father was such a cold and obtuse person that it was a wonder her mother hadn't cheated on him before that. She had known her father for her entire life and knew little about him, beside the fact that he liked trains. She couldn't remember a time when he had ever shown interest in something that she had liked, or even a time when he had just asked her about her day. It was sad when the most interesting thing about your father was that he might have killed your mother. The basement looked exactly the way she remembered it. The washer and the dryer still stacked with clean, unfolded clothes. The shelves still held a random assortment of things, and the train set still took up most of the floor space. Jessica grimaced. She would have to do something about it if she was going to sell the house. Some of those trains could even be worth money, she reflected. As if hearing her thoughts, something made an angry scutter across the tracks of the little town, and Jessica squeaked before retreating back up the stairs. Nuts to this, she would investigate the basement another day, maybe when Randy was free to help her. The basement had always been creepy to her, and that hadn't changed with time in the slightest. She slammed the door and went to look at the rest of the house, leaving the basement to its own devices. Joe felt the breeze as the diesel loco thundered down the tracks. He pulled the cord and listened to the whistle blow as he waved to the passers-by who had stopped to wait for the train. He couldn't remember anything before he had taken up the cap and overalls that made him the conductor of the Macklin line, but he was sure it hadn't been better than this. No wife, no kids, nothing but train times and passenger schedules. Sometimes when he wasn't driving the train, he sort of remembered someone from before he had come here. A woman and a girl, a house, a boring job, a boring life, but none of that really mattered. Joe was happy, happier than he had ever been, and as he drove past Bill's house, he waved to his old friend as he sat whistling on the porch. They would have some beers later, Millie cooking them another wonderful dinner, and then Joe would wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. Yes, sir, Macklin was the best little town in the whole damn world.
Looks like we're going from one train story to the next. So without further ado, let's hear about a weird little track in the woods. Let's hear a tale about track 54.5.
Driving a train sounds pretty exciting, right? It's really not. When you're taking your licensing course, you get a sense of excitement. You feel like you're part of a long legacy of train conductors. You imagine yourself dodging train robbers or having to solve a murder mystery, meeting guests for drinks in the dining car, or riding the trails to California or Texas. Well, in reality, you're mostly hauling cargo. Like many others, I found myself hauling freight cars through the dark at night. At this point in time, most things on the train come down to pushing buttons and trying not to hit people or things on the tracks. Run the horn every time you come within 100 feet of a crossing, make sure the tracks are in good shape, note any damage or signal malfunctions in your logbook, get to your destination and drop off your cargo. Rinse, repeat. I do the 6P to 6A run. Most of my route is done completely in the dark. The train rolls on while I sit at the controls, and Roger would take over every few hours so I can stand out on the platform and have a smoke or eat something out of the fridge we keep in the back. We don't haul passengers. Well, cattle sometimes. So there's no dining cars or sleeper cars or people besides Roger to talk to. After tonight, I guess I won't even have Roger. I'm pretty new at this, Roger having only worked here a few months longer than I had, and neither of us had any idea about track 54. All the tracks have mile markers, and between track mile 53 and 55 is, well, you guessed it, track 54. It runs through a deep stretch of woods, and the track is the only thing that's not trees or dirt for about 20 miles. It's a lonely stretch, and it gets a little creepy out there sometimes. Roger says it's bullshit, but I could swear you can see things in the woods watching the train as it goes by. The good thing about the woods is that they're only 10 miles from the depot we use to drop off cargo, so once you're there, you're almost half done with your shift. Tonight was a little different. I was sitting in the passenger seat, browsing Reddit on my phone, when I heard Roger swear and cut the brakes on sharply. I braced and looked out the glass, sucking in my breath when I realized why he had stopped. It's not uncommon to get stuff on the tracks, trees or animals sometimes, but this was definitely something we needed to call in. There was a body laying on the tracks. Roger keyed up the mic and called it in. Engine 13 here on track 54.5, he said, looking at the screen, reporting a body on the tracks. The line went dead for a few seconds before someone came back from dispatch. Engine 13, come back. Did you say a body on the tracks? 10-4, human body on the tracks, said Roger. More static before someone came back over. A different someone than the young woman who had answered us. Is it living or is it dead? Roger squinted at it for a moment. Does it matter? There's a body on the tracks. It's the difference between calling the police and calling an ambulance, so yes, it matters. Roger sighed, glancing left and right at the woods before handing me the radio. Keep these numbnuts updated while I go check what kind of body this is. Then he climbed out of the train and moved to the front of the cab. I could hear him calling the person on the tracks and getting no response. The body appeared to be sleeping there, arms and legs splayed out over the ballasts, but I couldn't tell if they were breathing or not from the cab. Roger didn't seem to want to leave the side of the train and investigate, probably wondering if this were a robbery of some kind. It's not as common as you'd think for people to block the tracks and rob a train. Our cargo was mostly cement powder or cinder blocks, maybe some quarried stone or various other things like AC units or unrefined oil. It's not really something a train robber would get away with easily. The handpiece crackled back to life as the older voice asked if we were still there. I told him we were, and that's when he asked for our location again. The way he asked made me feel a little anxious. He sounded relieved that I had answered, but sounded hesitant to have my location. Track 54.5, I told him, eyes still on Roger as he walked closer to the body. Silence for a good 10 seconds followed. I watched Roger creep towards the man, almost comically. My eyes cut to the woods for a half second, thinking I had seen movement in the trees. Was it an optical illusion? The only light was the big headlight, and it made things in the peripherals look weird sometimes. Roger was nearing the tracks when the mic cut back on and made me jump. "Drive over it." I stared at the handpiece in surprise. "What?" "Drive over it. Get the hell out of there. No one's supposed to leave the cabin after track 50. Did no one tell you that?" I looked back up to Roger, who was poking the body with his foot, before turning back towards the train. "No, I've only been a driver for a few months. Roger and I..." But as I watched Roger coming back, I saw something long and white come galloping out of the woods and snatch him up. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It looked like a collection of white pipe cleaners formed into some kind of weird animal and left in a backpack for a few days. It snapped up Roger in its mouth and was over the tracks and into the woods on the other side before I could get a good look at it. Roger was there 1 minute and then gone the next. Engine 13, respond." "Something got Roger," I yelled into the mic. He went out to check the body and..." "Get that train in motion, now," yelled the man on the other end of the radio. I pushed the button, threw some levers, and the train started moving again. I heard the wheels tear through the body on the tracks, a wet and meaty sound, and soon I had it back up to 45 miles an hour again. I felt my breath coming out in hitching gasps as the forest careened around me, but the creature never made another appearance. I could still see that thing as it cantered across the tracks. I could still see Roger's face creased in terror as it grabbed him and took him off into the woods. I suddenly doubted they would ever find Roger, ever find the body I had chopped up beneath my wheels, and I knew there would be no sign of the creature at all. When I pulled into the depot an hour later, there were people waiting for me. People in suits from the Department of Transportation. They told me I had done the right thing. They told me I'd been very brave and had saved my company millions of dollars in assets. They made me sign a lot of things and told me to take some time off before coming back to work, if I still wanted to work, that was. They advised that I not talk to anyone about what had happened and made me sign some papers saying that I wouldn't. Well, guess I screwed that up, didn't I? It's been a week and I still see that thing when I close my eyes. I researched that stretch of track and the woods that surrounded it. There are more than a few strange stories about a creature that lives there. A hiker recently went missing, a man with dark hair and a thick beard who was wearing jeans and a blue t-shirt the last time anyone saw him. A man I would swear I saw laid across the tracks that night when Roger was taken. The line keeps calling to ask if I'm coming back to work. I just don't know if I can ever drive through those woods again. After someone sees this, I may not have to worry about that anymore.
Let's finish up today's stories with a strange little tale about childhood habits that sometimes go awry. So let's hear a story about too many teeth.
"Daddy, I lost a tooth." He lisped a bit as he said it, and as I held my hand out, I saw that he had, indeed, lost a tooth. It was one of the front ones, and I congratulated him on losing it so cleanly. I wondered if he had pulled it out himself, but I put that out of my mind. Brandon didn't even pull his own splinters out, and I really couldn't see him yanking out his own teeth. He was 6 and 1 month, as he liked to say, and this was the first tooth that he had lost. He was late in that respect. Many of his friends had already started losing baby teeth, but he was giddy as he brought this one to me. "Now, the tooth fairy will come and take it away," he said, skipping off to continue playing. Ah, yes, I'd forgotten about that part. Brandon had become obsessed with the Tooth Fairy after his friend Nina had lost her tooth. He thought of her like the Blue Fairy from the Pinocchio story, and he was very excited that she would come through his window and leave money for his teeth. He had asked what she did with all those teeth, where she got all the money, and 1,000 other things. I was a pretty creative person, and I'd come up with all kinds of stories about what she did with them, where she got the money, and how she came in without making a sound. On and on and on. I was kind of glad that he had finally lost a tooth, because I was starting to run out of material and thought if he experienced it, he might lose interest in it. We put it under his pillow that night, and I assured him that it would be gone in the morning and there would be money when he got up. Then, of course, I fell asleep waiting for my wife to get home and woke up to find her sleeping beside me and the sun already peeking over the horizon. I went quickly but quietly and thanked my lucky stars that Brandon was a sound sleeper. He hadn't woken up yet, and I took the $1 I was going to put under his pillow out of my pocket and prepared to make the swap. To my surprise, however, the tooth was already gone. No one had left money, but the tooth had disappeared. I looked around, thinking it had slipped out, but it was just gone. I left the $1 anyway, not wanting him to be disappointed, and went back to my room to get more shut-eye before the alarm went off. We never made it to the alarm because Brandon came in waving the $1 and saying that the Tooth Fairy had come. "Look what the Tooth Fairy left me. He said it was all for me." I told him that was awesome, but internally I raised an eyebrow. He? The Tooth Fairy had always been a woman any time he'd talked about her before. Maybe, I thought, Brandon had just had a dream or something that night. He put the money in his piggy bank, and I figured we could maybe put the thing behind us. 2 days later, as I put him to bed, I put my hand beneath his pillow and felt something strange. I took my hand out and found another tooth. "What's this?" I asked. "Oh, I lost another tooth," Brandon said. No excitement, no hope that the Tooth Fairy would come, just a matter-of-fact tone. I guess that was what I wanted. His obsession with the Tooth Fairy had ended when he finally lost a tooth. He'd gone from being absolutely excited to absolutely unfazed, and that stopped me for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me you had another loose tooth, buddy?" I don't know. It just kind of happened. I put the tooth back under his pillow, telling him to make sure to say something next time, and then I kissed him goodnight and put him to bed. When I went to put the money under his pillow a little later, though, the tooth wasn't there. Instead, there was a coin. I took a look at it, thinking it was a $50, but realized I was wrong almost at once. At first, I thought it was one of those weird chocolate coins you sometimes got for Christmas. Turning it, I realized it was just extremely grubby. It was heavy, like it was made out of brass or copper, and the surface looked dirty, like it had been at the bottom of a well for quite some time. I started to take it with me, something in me wanting to keep it away from my son, but I put it back instead. It wasn't mine after all, and by the look of it, it was probably something that he treasured. It had been back under his pillow for less than a second before his hand went searching for it. His fingers took hold of it almost greedily as he clutched it, and I decided to take the $1 back with me. Brandon changed a bit after that night, but it's only in retrospect that I see it. He became very secretive, not my little buddy like he used to be. Brandon didn't want to play video games in the living room with me anymore. He didn't want to read stories at bedtime either. He spent a lot of time in his room and seemed to be closing off. His mother laughed at me when I told her that my feelings were a little bit hurt by it. "He's just being a kid. Kids go through phases sometimes. Don't take it so personally. A couple of months from now, he'll probably be back to his usual self again." I hoped he would, but it was hard to ignore the physical changes that were going on in him as well. Not only was Brandon quieter, but it seemed like he had grown. He hadn't gained a foot in a single week, but sometimes it seemed like his fingers were abnormally long. His arms strangely jointed, and his face was oddly stretched. He would look at me sometimes, look at me like he was thinking about doing something that he knew would make me angry. I didn't like it, but he never did it right out in the open. Like I said, Brandon never came to sit with me or play video games, but I would sometimes catch him peeking at me from the hallway or from under the table in the kitchen. It was creepy, but I figured it was just little kid behavior. A month after Brandon lost his first tooth, I found another one in his backpack. Well, no, not just one. I found 5 hidden in the front pocket of his backpack after he left it on the kitchen table when he went to go to the bathroom. He had become pretty protective of that backpack, putting it in his room or keeping it close by at all times, and I started getting suspicious of what might be in there. I didn't think it was drugs or anything. He was 6, but I thought it might be something weird or dangerous. What if he had a snake or something in there? So when he suddenly ran off to go to the bathroom, I knew this was my chance to have a look. I needed to sign his folder for school anyway, so I took out the folder and looked over the day's report before taking a peek in the pockets. The teeth were just sitting there, bumping together when I poked at them, but they didn't really look like human teeth. They looked more like animal teeth, and they were too strange to have come out of my son's mouth. They might have been from a cat or a dog, I suppose. Maybe a, "What are you doing?" I zipped the backpack and turned around, looking like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. "Nothing, just signing your folder." Brandon looked at me with a great deal of mistrust, taking the backpack and going to his room without putting his back to me. I told his mother about the teeth when she came back from work, but she brushed it off again, saying that little kids often collected strange things. "My brothers collected animal skeletons they found in the woods," she said dismissively, as we got ready for bed. "Thank goodness it's just teeth and not a whole skull." I let it go, but it was hard not to see what was going on. Brandon started looking like he wasn't sleeping well. He had huge bags under his eyes, and he was fidgety anytime he was made to sit still, like at dinner or for homework. He would get short and agitated, muttering to himself in a way I couldn't understand. I listened carefully once when he was doing math homework, and it sounded like he was talking in a different language. He looked up when he saw me noticing, squinting at me with that look of distrust, and it broke my heart to see him like that. Brandon had always been my little buddy, and this sudden change in him was painful to watch. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the school. They needed to speak with me about something important. Brandon, it seemed, had been in a fight where he had knocked more than a few of the kids' teeth out. I came down right away, afraid that Brandon had been hurt, but when I saw him sitting in the principal's office, he looked none the worse for wear. He had a bruise on his cheek, and his hands looked like he had beat them against a wall, but he didn't seem injured or in distress at all. Quite the contrary, Brandon looked happier than I had ever seen him. I took a seat next to him in the office, waiting to see what they thought was so important. "We called you in, not because Brandon has been fighting, but because of other rumors going around his class." "Rumors?" I asked. "Yes, sir. The student he fought with said Brandon had been making strange deals with other students." I shook my head, not quite understanding. "What kinds of deals?" "They say he's been buying people's teeth." I shuddered, thinking about the teeth in the bag I'd saw not too long ago. I looked down at Brandon, questioning him with my eyes as to whether it was true. He looked back at me without hesitation, pretty much letting me know that it was. He's been trading his lunch for them. He's been trading other things for them too, toys and small things. He's allegedly traded over 20 students for their teeth across 3 grades. Today, the student in question had taken the trade but refused to give him any teeth. Your son responded by beating the teeth out of his mouth. I looked down at Brandon, asking what he was thinking. He didn't bother to answer, just clenched his fists in his lap and looked at the floor. I think that was when it really hit me how much he had changed. The bags under his eyes were dark and deep, and his fingers were long enough that I couldn't see how anyone didn't notice. Each finger seemed twice as long as it should be, and as he clenched, I could see a fourth knuckle on each of them. The reason we called you in, sir, is, well, to get those teeth back. I turned and looked at the principal. What do you mean? He looked a little green as he wiped his forehead with a napkin. We believe your son has the missing teeth, but he won't tell us where they are, and he won't give them back to us. We can't seem to find them, and the mother is hopeful that the dentist can put them back in if they're not too badly damaged. If anything else, they want them back so they can take them to the dentist and make sure they're baby teeth and not permanent. Brandon hasn't said a word about where he put them, and we are deeply troubled by this behavior. I looked at Brandon and asked him where the teeth were. He shook his head, not saying a word. I asked him again, and when he shook his head this time, I heard something. Something nearly indistinguishable, but altogether unsettling. Something was rattling in his mouth. We can sit here until you decide to give us the teeth, but you're not leaving until we get them back. I don't know what's gotten into you, I said, but the idea that we wouldn't be leaving seemed to decide him. He bent slowly over the principal's desk, making eye contact with the older man the whole time as he opened his mouth. 3 teeth fell out as he pushed his tongue out, and none of them appeared to be his. The teeth clattered on the desk like old dice.